So I get this text. Dan, it was Dan's originally, right? And you swapped with me? Is that how this worked? No? Okay. Okay. It's a difficult text. It's difficult because of its severity, right? Because of its just the serious nature of it. But it is something that we need, that our hearts need. And so I'm grateful for it being here in the canon of Scripture and in this letter in particular. So let's do a little reset. 2 weeks ago, we looked at chapter 4 and verses 11 through 17. So that's the text we looked at 2 weeks ago. Last week, I did a sort of a hit the pause button. We just talked about providence in general and how to apply that to our idea of planning and things like that. So in that text, in verses 11 through 17 of chapter 4, Pastor James warned the church against the evil of presumption, of presuming. Specifically, he cited two frequent violations in this area: presumptuous judging and presumptuous planning, right? These were meant to be correctives. That is, those two instances of presumption that James is addressing were meant to be corrective in nature for Christians in the church. You, Christian, do these things. Who are you to judge? Who are you to presume upon tomorrow? Don't behave like that. There is a God who sits on the throne, who is the only one capable of pure judgment, and the one who rules over our plans. And so it was meant to be this corrective, to remind the church, to call the church not to be arrogant, to remember who they are in relation to God. But in today's text, we take a significant turn. While not all agree, James turns his attention now to unbelievers within the church. Unbelievers within the church. It is not then a warning for Christians to beware of evil behavior that they can easily slip into, though that may be an application. Rather, this is a warning against the judgment of God coming for those who trust in their riches that they accumulate, rather than the riches of God's grace found in Christ. So it's one of many different passages that we could find in the Scriptures that speak a word to those that have found their way in the church but don't truly belong to the church. In other words, this is not so much a call for Christians to forsake sin and live holy lives. Rather, it's a warning against the disaster that comes from a life of idolatry, specifically the idols of earthly riches. You who are in the church that live like this, be warned. That's the tenor. That's the character of this text. We're in James chapter 5, 1 through 6. So here's our theme. Lusting after earthly treasures ends in misery. Lusting after earthly treasures ends in misery. It ends in misery, first of all, because the earthly treasures that men can lust after always, friends, always disappoint. They fail to bring the lasting joy that's promised or hoped for. They fail to bring the satisfaction and contentment and security that your heart was certain it would bring. Notice the examples of the treasures. What do you see there as examples of treasures in our text? They're listed. You see them? What kinds of treasures? Tell me a verse number and an idea. Okay, so clothing or garments, right? We see that in, where is that, Jan? In verse 2. What else? Yeah, gold and silver, verse 3. And you might gloss over the first one. It just simply says riches in verse 2. And that word for riches is oftentimes understood as a reference to crops. And that would have been in an agrarian or farming kind of culture, that would have been a way to measure your wealth, right? Like, look at this massive harvest we just had, that kind of thing. And if that's so, it fits this passage nicely with the reference to the rich who own fields and hire men working the harvest in them in verse 4 that we'll get to. But the crops and clothing and precious metals are a composite picture of what the wicked rich trust in. It's not a list that is, what do you call that? Comprehensive. It's not listing all of the possible things somebody could put their hope in this vicinity of wealth, right? But it's representative of the kinds of things that somebody could put their trust in. Put it in today's parlance. Dan, you don't trust in crops. What are the things that we tend to put our trust in the area of wealth? Yeah, that's retirement accounts, right? And why do people put trust in their retirement accounts? Like, work that out for me. What does that look like? Why do they do that? What's the purpose? What's going on in somebody's heart? Okay, relying on yourself for what? For the future, right? I'm going to be good later. I've got this security blanket of a retirement account that's got this amount of money in it. I'll want for nothing, right? I mean, isn't that, you're in this business, right? I mean, people are so often putting all of their eggs in the basket of, man, if I just plan it well enough for my retirement, my life will be good, I'll be safe, and that sort of thing. And again, going back to last text, it's not that planning is stupid or foolish, right? So there's discernment that we have to do here. We ought to plan, but we can't worship the things that we're planning, right? So what are some other things that we tend to put our... Tim, you looked like you were about to say something over here. Did you have something on your mind? No? Okay, yeah, right. I mean, that's a common theme, right? Especially somebody of your stature, age, Jeremy, maybe you're not thinking so much about retirement accounts. What are you thinking about? Okay, so money for college, whether that's working hard to get some kind of scholarship or getting a job so that you could, and save up enough money so that you can afford the tuition, or working dad somehow to get, or whatever. But we can do that, can't we? It can become our sole focus, and it can snuff out everything else. And we could put some time here, right? I don't want to pick on anybody, but Ashley, you're up front. You've got a nice outfit on today, and we can put our trust in what we look like, can't we? It can become obsessive. And it's not so much, when we think about clothing, right, that you got a nice jacket on there, Vaughn, it's not so much security or safety or something like that, but rather my identity, right? My identity is, I want people to think well of me because what I look like, right? And so we can put our hope in these things. This idea is not unlike the contrast described in Psalm 20 and verse 7, a familiar verse. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust, how's that end? In the name of the Lord our God, right? The next half of the verse says this: they collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. I mean, that really kind of encapsulates it, doesn't it? Where is your trust? Now, in specifically dealing with people of wealth, right? It's not so much chariots, although that might be a way of measuring wealth in a certain age, right? It's that those things that are in this category of wealth, whether it's clothing or retirement accounts or chariots or whatever, right? The reason that lusting after them will end in misery is because they will not satisfy. They won't pull off what it is your heart tells you they will do. It's not the existence of wealth now, mind you, right? We've got to be careful. But it's the love of it, the worship of it that's condemned. Flip over to 1 Timothy 6. I just want to really compare and contrast a couple of verses with almost no comment. But I think it's, I'm going to preach this in a few weeks here. But 1 Timothy chapter 6. Somebody give me 1 Timothy 6, 9 through 10. Who will do that? The audience participation portion of the program. Thank you, Helen. 1 Timothy 6, 9 and 10, and then somebody else in that same chapter, verses 17 to 19. Is that Nathan? Okay. First Timothy 6, 9 and 10 when you get there, Helen. Yeah, so what verbs in those two verses that Helen just read tell you that it's not money itself, but rather the worship of money that's wrong? What are the verbs in that? Is that King James you were reading from? Okay. Covet? Covet's in there, right? Or desire, right? Or it's that word for lust after. What else is in there? Say again. No, I mean, what verb in relation to money? The love of money is there, right? Well, that's actually a noun, isn't it? But to love money would be the verb form of that, right? And what else? Yeah, it's just, it's got desire to be rich. Yeah, that's right. And so, but it has to do with this idea of desire at the heart level, right? Which doesn't surprise us based on the teaching from chapter 4 about how idols are formed in people's hearts, right? Through passions. Okay, now compare that against, what were the other verses, 17 through 19? Who had, Nathan, you have that? So you see what Paul's teaching there. He's not saying tell the rich people in your church to get rid of their riches. That's not what he's saying. Like, sinner, get rid of the money, empty your bank account, sell your nice clothes. That's not what's being talked about here, right? It's rather employ your resources for the good of others. Store up treasure not in this world, but in the next by being rich in what? Good works, right? So, I mean, we could spend a lot of time there, but that's really a beautiful comparison contrast on how riches can be a snare if you give your heart to it, but they can be this great blessing in bringing about the good works that Titus talks about. Jesus, purchasing a people for his own possession who are zealous for that kind of good works, right? It's what the church ought to look like. Okay, so the examples of the treasures, we've seen that. We've seen that they at least this first part with the idea that they don't bring about what the heart tells us they will. So let's look at that a little bit more. The collapse of idols, James foretells here, right? Look at what happens to all those riches that we listed out, right? If the riches or the crops, if you will, what happens to them? They rot, right? A week or so ago, maybe 10 days ago, I ran over to Kroger, and every couple weeks I run over there and I buy a handful of healthy snacks so there's something here at the office so I don't end up eating junk, right? And I bought a little, those little plastic trays full of blueberries, and I bought one full of blackberries. And for lunch that day, I washed them and I made a little meal of that and some other things, right? And that's the last time I touched those trays. And yesterday I pulled them out of my fridge, and oh man, did they look gross, right? They were rotten. They were spoiled. They didn't look right. They didn't smell. There's nothing right about them. And that's just a small example to say, like, those things don't last, right? I can't put my hope in food I'm not a farmer, but, if I had crops, like, they're not going to last, right? And what happens to the other riches that are mentioned there? Yeah, garments wear out. Do you have a favorite piece of clothing that you're like, I can't wear this anymore, right? This will show you how old manish I am. I love to wear slippers, okay? I know that sounds like, how old is this guy, 100, right? I bring slippers to other people's houses so that I'll keep my feet warm if I'm sitting in your living room because I don't want to have my shoes on your rug, right? And Courtney bought this pair of slippers that I just loved. They were comfortable, they kept my feet warm, and they looked a little bit like dress shoes. I loved them. And the inside finally wore out, and I just simply couldn't wear them anymore. And I've been searching for years now for a pair to replace them. And I got a new pair for Christmas, and they're okay. But they're not the ones that wore out, Garments don't last. They don't. They wear out, right? And what's the other? Yeah, precious metals don't last either. I mean, we think like gold and silver, man, those things are indestructible. No, they're not. Nothing in this world is, right? Another way to think about it is, let's return to the retirement account. Anybody have a retirement account that ever took a big hit? Boy, man, right? These things don't last. They're not bulletproof, right? Okay, so remember, James would have been familiar with the teachings of Jesus, his half-brother. Perhaps James had in mind, when the Lord had told the story of the rich young ruler, to reveal how his wealth was his God. Jesus had said this in Matthew 19:22, "Sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." Now, that's not prescriptive. That's not to say everyone should sell everything they have and give to the poor 100%, not have anything in reserves and plan with nothing. That's not what he's teaching. He was putting his finger on that man's idol, what he put his hope in. But it seems clear that James had in the front of his mind the Lord's teaching found earlier in Matthew's gospel. I've messed up the reference. I think it's Matthew 6:19. Jesus said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where what happens? Where moth and rust destroy. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys." He also adds that people could break in and steal things. James even uses this same language of laying up or storing up treasures in our text in verse 3. And he even adds the little phrase, "on the earth," in verse 5, rather than in heaven, right? So it seems that James has this in his mind. And because the rich have set their heart's affections on these deteriorating things, their hopes will be dashed. James calls for them to awaken to their folly, and he does it right from Jump Street, right from verse 1. "Come now, you rich, what should you do? In light of the fact that you've put your hope in things that will not last, that will not actually achieve what your heart is telling you they will, what should you do? Weep and howl." Why? "For the miseries that are coming upon you." These things won't last, and so they cannot provide comfort and security and lasting happiness. If the rich's sense of identity and worth, we talked about this a minute ago, is wrapped up in such things, the loss of them causes them to lose their mind. How am I to think of myself now? Have you ever had that sort of life-altering event? It might not be the loss of riches, it might have been. But it might have been the loss of a job, or or friends that decided you weren't going to be in the friend group anymore and shunned you for some reason. You ever had that kind of really sort of life-altering kind of event that happens? It knocks you off your pins, because before I thought of myself in those terms. I was their friend. I had that kind of money. I was at that kind of level. I had that job. And that's how I saw myself, as somebody with that job. And now those things are gone. And now how do I think about myself? In a very real way, when you put your trust in things that don't last and they wear out, you don't know how to think about yourself anymore. It's like you come undone. And that can happen. It's misery. But it's also, this idea of coming misery is also foreboding. It suggests an even greater misery than simply going from riches to poverty. It was foreshadowed back in chapter 1. If you're still in James, flip to chapter 1, and somebody read verses 9 through 11 for me. James 1, 9 through... Yep. Okay, stop. That's a strange thing to say, right? Let the lowly brother boast in their exaltation. What does that even mean? It means their coming exaltation, the exaltation they have as the righteous of God, what's coming for them, right? In other words, even though you're lowly, and whatever that lowliness looks like, if you're in Christ, boast, because exaltation's coming. And likewise, what's the next part? The rich, what? So the rich ought to boast in their coming humiliation, which this is a use of irony, right? Nobody boasts because misery's coming. But it's the flip side of the coin. If you put your trust in the things of this world, go ahead and boast, but your humiliation is on the horizon. It's coming. And so it was and we'll skip the rest, but you could read the rest. Everything fades, right? The flowers of the fields fade, and those sorts of things. And so it was hinted at in chapter 1. This ultimate humiliation is when one's God is unable to save them. That's the ultimate humiliation. This is my God, and it turns out this God actually can't save. It's like when Elijah goes up against the Baals. Right? Oh, can your gods not hear you? It's that kind of thing. Humiliation, right? But ultimate humiliation, right? With all of the rich man's rotting and disintegrating treasures, the only God that remains is the true God, in whom he has not placed his hope. And God does not reward those who reject him in order to worship false gods. That's the ultimate misery coming. Verse 3, their corrosion, those precious metals, their corrosion will be evidence against you. The picture hints at God's courtroom judging the evidence of the putrefying possessions of the rich who refuse to treasure their Creator. When I was a bachelor, I don't know if you've ever bought a cucumber that went bad, but this won't seem weird to you because of what I just said to you about the blueberries and that. But when I was a bachelor, I would frequently pack my fridge full of good stuff and then order pizza 4 days in a row. And as I was cleaning out my refrigerator one time, I opened one of those plastic drawers that you're supposed to put your vegetable in, and there was something that used to be a cucumber in there. It had liquefied. It was the grossest smelling, looking, feeling thing I'd ever seen. And it's like that's the evidence in God's courtroom. Look at what you've put your trust in. It testifies against you. And that's the courtroom scene that's being described here. That's exhibit A in the trial to prove whether you trusted in what was of ultimate value. And that scene is summed up with the horrifying description of the evidence itself devouring their flesh like fire. Fire is that typical symbol in the scriptures of God's judgment. And that's the scene that's being described of. It's horrifying. I mean, think about the sacrificial system. Fire, right? Fire at the altar would devour, right, the offering for sin. And when there's no acceptable offering for sin, the sinner himself is consumed. And that's the picture of God's courtroom for the rich that have placed their trust in things that will not last. So lusting after earthly treasure ends in misery because those riches always disappoint. But it also ends in misery because lusting after earthly treasure results invariably in hurting other people. Invariably. We see this love of others versus hatred of others in the remainder of the text. And remember what book we're in. Remember what's going on in the book of James, at the 35,000 foot. James is saying that the people of God are easily identifiable by their obedient lives, by the way they love people, by the way they love God and love neighbor. Their faith is proved by how it shapes their lives. That's what's going on largely in James, right? And so love is a fruit of the Spirit. Serving others, particularly those in need, is evidence of genuine faith. James says this very plainly, right? Sorry, I can't seem to turn my page. Remember chapter 1 and verse 27, famous verse, right? James talks about what pure and undefiled religion looks like. It looks like coming to people in their need and giving to them and making provision for them. Not just visiting in the sense of looking in on somebody and saying hello, but coming to them in their distress and meeting their needs. And what about chapter 2 and verses 14 through 17, that little passage about faith without works is dead? You remember the example that's given? You see somebody in real need, and you essentially say, hey, hope it all works out for you, and don't help them and keep on walking. That's dead faith. That's not what genuine faith looks like. The faithful seek God's wisdom to know how to live, too. We learned this in chapter 3 and verses 17 and 18. The result is that they evidence their faith with purity, peace, gentleness, and mercy. They produce lots of good fruits, a harvest of righteousness. This is what genuine faith is to look like, but not so the rich being addressed here in this text. Selfish gain, on the other hand, is the fruit of an unbelieving heart of sin. Serving oneself, even at the expense of others, is a mark of false faith. It is evidence of unbelief. For example, we learned that unbelief is seen in bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in chapter 3 and verse 13. And in verse 16, a couple verses later, it says that every vile practice will accompany that kind of jealousy and that kind of me-first movement, even harming other people. And even in chapter 4 and verses 1 and 2, we read of the idolater being happy to fight against others if it only means their wicked passions will be served. Getting a real insight into the heart of those who put their trust in things that are not Christ. We saw in verse 3 those rotting riches being presented as the first pieces of evidence against those who trusted in them to save. Two more pieces of evidence are now brought forward: the unpaid wages of the workers and the oppressed workers themselves. Look at verse 4 there. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. Those monies that you should have paid them, they are offering testimony against you. And it goes on, and also the cries of the harvesters themselves. They have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. Remember, James and his audience are Jews now, as you think through this. They're believing Jews. They were raised in the Old Testament scriptures. Consider teachings that they would have been familiar with. Care of the poor is an essential element of the Mosaic Law. Provisions in the law are all over the place where care is afforded to the needy, like not harvesting your fields all the way to the edge so that poor people could get the stuff on the edges. And when you gather up what you have harvested and some falls on the ground in a little heap, don't bend down and pick it up. Leave it there so a poor person can come and get that. And we could go on and on. That's just a couple of examples of things that are in the law that require people of means to take care of people who are in need. This was so that people of means could employ their riches to care for people who need daily food in order to survive. But verse 4 describes the rich withholding wages from hard-working laborers, men whose families normally lived hand to mouth, who couldn't afford to miss a paycheck. And so this is in that camp. This is in the, I'm not going to, I want that stuff for me. I don't care if somebody else is in need. In addition, a constant refrain in the Old Testament is judgment against those who take advantage of the poor. It's a constant refrain. Amos delivered a fiery judgment against the powerful in the north who advanced their position at the expense of the poor. Let me just give you an example. Amos 2, verses 6 and 7. Amos was a nobody sheep herder that went to the north to take on the rich and powerful in the northern kingdom. And he said this to them: "For 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted." Judgment's coming against people like that. Just as the wicked rich in Israel did in Amos's day, so they did in the early church, and they do today. Look at verse 5 there. They lived in luxury and in self-indulgence. They lavished on themselves at the expense of people that were in real need. James is describing this sort of compounding wickedness, that these people are not merely withholding their riches while the poor among them starve, like in the neighborhood or something. That is wicked enough. That is robbing God of thanksgiving and of glory by withholding God's gifts to those that need them. Worse than that, James said they were hiring the working poor at hard labor to make themselves rich and then not paying them. They're the worst for having come into contact with these rich people that trust in treasure. And so you see this truth again, that when you lust after earthly riches, invariably going hand in hand with that is taking advantage and harming other people to get it. Again, this isn't merely not treating someone fairly. It's putting their lives in peril. Look at how verse 6, the temperature's turned up. You have murdered the righteous person. Now, surely James doesn't mean actual murder, but like murder that's done in the heart. Jesus taught that actual murder isn't required to fall under judgment, under God's law, but hatred and contempt and treating people poorly in your heart, that's akin to murder. The love of money will cause men to do terrible things to get it and keep it. It corrupts their minds. It corrupts their actions. There's actually an allusion here back to a real murder. Wonder if you thought about it. The field is crying out. That was one of the evidences against these rich people. The murdered harvesters are crying out. And those cries reach God's ears. Remember the account of Cain and Abel? Remember what Cain did for a living? He owned fields. He was somebody that produced crops. He was an owner of riches, of crops. And on one of those fields, probably one he owned, he met his brother and murdered him there. Genesis 4:10, the Lord said to him, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Surely that's an allusion back to that first evil. Sin had mastered Cain there, and the love of wealth does the same thing in the hearts of men. They will fight and quarrel, they will sin, and they will even murder to get it and keep it. Notice that it's in the heart. The second half of verse 5 there, you have fattened your heart. And that fattening was metaphorically like fattening up an animal that was to be slaughtered. They fattened their hearts for the day of slaughtering. That's a metaphor of God's coming judgment. Those cries reached the ears of God just in the same way that Sodom's wickedness reached the ears of God, and he came down to check it out for himself and then leveled that city. Just in the same way that at the end of Exodus, the groans and cries of the Israelites who were enslaved reached the ears of God. And what did he do? He sent plagues. Judgment comes against such wickedness. Judgment comes. Judgment is ominously lurking throughout the passage, the evidence against them in God's courtroom, flesh being eaten like fire, the cries of those they wronged reaching God's ears. It's a terrifying passage, but an indispensable part of the gospel. The bad news is that those who trust in something other than Christ will come to ruin. They will come under the condemnation of God himself, in whom they ought to have trusted. They will bring eternal misery upon themselves. But there is also a note of hope here. It's a faint one. You have to find it and set your heart on it. It's a whiff. It's remarkable for those who will see it. Look at verse 6 there. You've condemned, you have murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. The righteous place their trust in God regardless of their circumstances. That's the patterned life of the righteous. Even when they lose everything in this world, riches, reputation, family, liberty, even their life, the righteous entrust themselves to God. Think of the endurance of Job in the face of all of his calamities. He's the quintessential righteous man in the Old Testament. Or the success of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers. That's a life of faith being modeled there, and God using a man that had fallen on disastrous times. Rehearse the names of the faithful in Hebrews 11 and all that happened to those folks. The righteous are those who live by faith, not by sight, and they're called to live after the example of our Savior, who willingly lost all for the joy that was set before him. The crown of righteousness awaits for those who endure the trials. That's the hope that's found in this text. It's the hope that the rich need to be pointed to. But they need to feel the weight of the misery that will come before they can see that hope. And that's a way for you and I to administer the gospel to people that we oftentimes value more than the poor. That's talked about earlier in James. And those that we think, man, they're exalted now, and don't think about what happens later. It's an essential element of the gospel. I hope it's a blessing to you. Hope it prepares you. So, Dolores, it's good to see you. Russ, you want to close us in prayer?